Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. This program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au for the next few weeks, if not a month or two. And this program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. It has been broadcast courtesy of the Community Radio Network from the studios of Radio 3CR, a member of the Community Radio Network based in Fitzroy in Melbourne. So if you wonder what anarchy is all about, the word anarchos means without rulers. Not without rules, without rulers. So what is the main issue facing anarchists? How do you create a society without rulers? Well, you look at what gives rulers powers, and what gives rulers their power is inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve power and share wealth. That's the struggle to make people's lives better on a day-to-day basis. So if you're involved in the struggle to make people's lives better, to share wealth, if you're involved in the struggles to devolve power, well then you are an anarchist, whether you know it or not. It's about creating a society without rulers. Well, care before profits. Now, you may not know this, as most of our listeners are under 15, obviously, on the Anarchist World This Week, but there is a Royal Commission into the nursing home sector going on. And it's not a pretty picture that's been painted. You know, we've had Royal Commission institutionalised child abuse, and it was a terrible picture. We've had a Royal Commission into the financial and banking sector, disgusting picture. We now have a Royal Commission into the nursing home sector. Now, before you go jump up and down, let's look at the history behind this change and why we find ourselves in this situation and why people are using the slogan, care before profits. Now, for the last 30 years, there have been major moves afoot by governments of all political colours to privatise nursing home care, to make it a private business. In 1987, in order to smooth the way for the profiteers in the nursing home sector, in 1987, legislation was passed which actually removed the staff-patient ratio. In 1987, you had to provide one staff member for 5 residents in a nursing home. That was removed. We've had a number of legislative initiatives over the last 20 years which have allowed the private sector, the corporate sector, to actually dominate the nursing home sector. And people who are calling for care before profits need to understand that the nursing home sector is run by a small number of corporations, as is unemployment, as is Social Security. And the list goes on and on. So what we've seen is the corporatisation of a sector which was in public hands or in the not-for-profit sector hands. Now, most of these corporations are shareholder-listed companies. People invest in nursing homes in order to make a buck. It's very simple. It's not care before profits, it's profits before care. So how do you make a buck from the nursing home sector? Well, it's very simple. One, you create a virtual monopoly which allows a small number of corporations to dominate that sector, as we've seen in the childcare sector, as we've seen in the government giving over the provision of social security to the private sector, as we saw with the abolition of the old Commonwealth Employment Service and the privatisation of the Commonwealth Employment Service. So how do you make a buck from old people? How do you make a buck from frail old people? How do you keep your shareholders happy and ensure they don't sell those shares and that they get ever-increasing profits every year? Well, it's very simple. One, you scrimp on staff. Two, you scrimp on qualified staff. So what you do is you remove expertise from staff. So you have poorly qualified, unqualified people providing that basic care for a minimal wage. How's the second way you make a buck in the private nursing home sector? You decrease the number of staff for residents. So your staff-resident ratios increase and increase and increase. How is there another way you make a buck? Food. That's right, food. You don't feed people properly. You feed them the basic necessities. How's another way? Well, elderly folk who are demented or who are confused can cause a lot of issues in a privately run nursing home. So what you do is you sedate them. So although it's frowned on to use physical restraints on people, it is not frowned on to use chemical restraints. So if a pliant medical staff, you medicalise people. You fit them into chemical straitjackets. And at the end of the day, those profits continue to rise. And what's the other way you make a profit? You overcharge people. You charge them ridiculous bonds and then ridiculous fees for what is basically a basic service. Now, obviously, if you're going to privatise the nursing home sector, what do you expect? What do you expect? If you allow a handful of corporate-owned, shareholder, stock market-listed corporations to dominate the nursing home sector, what do you expect? Their major responsibility is not to the person they are caring for, but to their shareholders. And if you remove legislation which financially and physically and intellectually and mentally, psychologically protects residents, what do you expect? No wonder the Morrison-led Liberal National Party government has been forced, that's right, forced with a capital F, to hold a royal commission into this sector. At the end of the day, it's not about avarice, greedy corporations running the nursing home sector. It's about lazy, stupid politicians who have passed legislation which has allowed these monopolies to dominate such an essential feature of existence in our society. Ultimately, the fault lies at their door. as we saw with the Royal Commission of the banking and financial sector. I mean, it's another classical case of what happens when you have corporatisation and privatisation, where you allow a few large corporations to dominate the financial and banking sector, whose major responsibility is not to their customers or their staff, it's to their shareholders, to maximise profits for their shareholders. So what do you expect when you pass legislation which removes regulations which were put in place to protect people using the financial sector? When you pass legislation which allows these organisations to bypass the law because the regulatory authorities like APRA and ASIC are underfunded, grossly underfunded, so they can actually not carry out their tasks. And when they are in a position to carry out their tasks, you water down the laws to such an extent that these people will not be prosecuted. So what we are seeing currently, whether it's the nursing home sector, whether it's the child care sector, whether it's the privatised Commonwealth Employment Service, whether it's the provision of social security services to people on social security benefits, is the fact that corporatisation and privatisation have decreased competition, put increasing pressure on patients, clients and customers, have removed the regulatory authority of governments, and all this has been done courtesy of a political system which we'll be asked to vote for in a few months' time, which has allowed laws to be put in place which puts the interests of shareholders of major corporations, their major shareholders, before the interests of the nation, before the interests of the community, before the interests of their customers, clients or patients, and before the interests of the staff in those organisations. So what we are doing today is we're reaping the benefits of 40 years of privatisation, deregulation, corporatisation and globalisation. And nothing highlights this more than the mess the nursing home sector is in today because of government initiatives and legislation which have allowed a few unaccountable corporations whose major responsibility is to increase profits for their major shareholders annually above the interests of every other segment of that industry. Think about it. Join the dots. You listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. $5 billion. You can do a lot of things with $5 billion. It's cost $5 billion over the last 5 years to provide services and security for about 1,500 human hostages which have been held by the Liberal National Party in conjunction with support from the Australian Labor Party. And I'm talking about asylum seekers and refugees who find themselves on Nauru and Manus Island. There's about 1,200 left. And every time I hear some politician, some media commentator, somebody in the community telling me the current policies that have been put in place to save lives, in inverted commas, I feel sick to the pit of my stomach. Now, we've seen over the last 24 hours machinations in the House of Representatives and the Senate, which will make some cosmetic and minimal changes to the lives of people on Manus Island and Nauru. Because these people are human hostages. They have been held hostage by this government for the last 6 years, not for any crimes they have committed. I mean, the only crime they've committed is asking for refuge or asylum in this country. Not because they are criminals, but because they've had the audacity to put their lives at risk and take a boat to get to these shores in order to apply for asylum or refugee status. They are hostages. They are held hostage by the current government to ensure that other people don't make the same journey. They're human hostages. For 6 years they've been held hostage. And when everybody jumps up and down and says what a huge issue it is, that a little bit of paltry legislation has been passed through Parliament, which gives doctors a little bit of extra power in terms of deciding who needs and who doesn't need evacuation from Manus or Nauru, you begin to wonder what planet we live on. I'll give you an example. It's very simple. Now, Mr. Mockbell, drunk king, sentenced to 30 years in jail for running a major drug syndicate, okay? Mr. Mockbell gets assaulted and stabbed in Barwon Prison in Victoria. Guards are there within a few minutes. Resuscitation procedures are put in place. A helicopter is called in. Mr. Mockbell, remember a convicted felon, is flown to the Royal Melbourne Hospital, where he receives the best care possible in order to save his life. Now, I've got no problem with any of this. I think this is fine. But let's compare the situation of Mr. Mockbell and medical care and the situation of people on Nauru and Manus Island who've done no wrong except apply for asylum and maybe paid some people smugglers to get here. What happens to them? They get sick. It's ministerial discretion on whether they're removed and come to Australia for treatment. And we've seen many people over the years who have died unnecessarily of medical complications because of the cumbersome type of system where the Minister for Home Affairs, or whatever it is, Homelands Affairs, has the say on who comes into Australia or not. Not medical practitioners who've got skills in that particular area who know what facilities are available in that particular location. No. Their opinions don't matter. They do matter in the case of Mr. Mockbell. They did matter in the case of Mr. Mockbell. So why shouldn't the same standard of care be applied for people who we are responsible for? Those 1,000 men on Manus Island are there because the Australian government put them there. Irrespective of what the High Court of New Guinea found that they were put there illegally, they still linger there. And the great majority have been found to be refugees who've got a good reason to be there. So when you look at that $5 billion, that's $464 per person, $464,000 per person per year, $1,600 a day. What an extraordinary waste of money. And when you look at the companies which are involved in the so-called security and care of these people, it's very difficult to understand how $5 billion is necessary to look after 1,300 people over 5 years. $1 billion a year. So, we save lives by destroying lives? What we are seeing is the torture of hostages. Nothing more, nothing less. Very simple. And the tragedy is that it's all legal. Legal. And when the opposition has a chance to make a decision, make a difference, they take a step backwards because they're concerned of being wedged into a corner with an election coming up in May by a hostile media, hostile legacy media, which somehow thinks it's okay to have hostages. It's okay to punish people in order to stop other people getting here. It's a little bit like taking your kids away and saying, well, if you don't, if you do the right thing, we'll send them back. Otherwise, we're going to keep them here. Just extraordinary. Extraordinary. And what's even more extraordinary is that it's legal. Legal. My apologies to Mr. Paul Keating. I'll give you an example. Now, Australians are under the illusion that their constitution somehow protects them from the arbitrary exercise of state power. The Australian Constitution is one of the most innocuous, simple-minded documents that has ever been written by human beings on the face of this planet since time immemorial. It is essentially a document which regulates the relationship between the individual states, the 6 states, and the central government, the federal government. And it's no accident that this is the Constitution, because in the 1890s, Australia had an opportunity to either be divided up into 6 independent nation states or to form a federation. And the Constitution was structured, and the Constitution which was put to the people of Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, West Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, was all about maintaining state rights and that relationship between the federal government and the state government. The individual plays no role in the Australian Constitution. The individual is irrelevant. There are no protections for the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power, as we have seen with non-citizens, asylum seekers and refugees, where the High Court has found time and time again that it is legal to hold people indefinitely. End of story. Under the constitutional arrangements, it is legal. Now, for some reason, we have this illusion that we have constitutional protections regarding a number of things, like freedom of speech. There is no guaranteed freedom of speech in the Australian Constitution. The Australian High Court, when asked to deliberate on this issue, issued a finding that Australians had a implied limited freedom of speech during an election campaign. There is no freedom of speech in the Australian Constitution. There is no freedom of association in the Australian Constitution. For example, the current building watchdog has extraordinary powers over individual citizens, over trade unionists. It has been structured in such a way as to criminalise people for joining trade unions. And if you get a tap on the shoulder by this commission, you're forced to talk to them in camera, in secret, and if you refuse to answer questions, you can be fined and jailed. While Mr. Mockbell was initially caught, he didn't have to say anything to the authorities because he could claim his right not to speak, not to incriminate himself. But if you're a building worker, a member of the FMEU in this country, you have no such rights. You have less rights than somebody who's who's charged with the crime of importing $1 billion worth of drugs, or somebody who's charged with a crime of, abusing, young children, sexually abusing young children, or somebody who's charged with a crime of murder or rape or battery or assault. You have the right to remain silent in law. But if you're a building worker, if you're a CFMEU worker, the current Building Commission has the right to question you, and if you don't cooperate, you can be jailed. It's again with the so-called anti-terrorist laws we have at the minute. And I say so-called because not anti-terrorist laws, they're laws against freedom of speech, freedom of association. It's very simple. The current government has the power, the Attorney General has the power to ban any organisation he or she feels may pose a threat to security, may pose a threat to national security. They have that extraordinary power. And if you belong to that organisation and you continue to speak on behalf of that organisation or be a member of that organisation or raise funds with that organisation, you can be jailed for up to 25 years. And you can be arrested at any time because the government authority believes you may have information which may assist them in their investigations into a terrorist act. And if you refuse to answer questions, you can be jailed for up to 5 years. So constitutionally, there is no protection for freedom of speech. There is no protection. There is no protection for freedom of association. And we saw this at the end of World War I, when the industrial workers of the world, a group which vigorously opposed the conscription of working people, was outlawed, and its members, even members in their 80s, were jailed for being members of a banned organisation. And it gets better. If the Commonwealth Government believes that security could be an issue, it has the right to override the local police force. But more importantly, it has the right to shoot and kill without any legal recourse, because they are indemnified. Individuals in that association, whether it's the Australian Armed Forces, are indemnified from prosecution. So those of you who think that we have constitutional protections need to understand there are no constitutional protections from the arbitrary exercise of state power in this country. End of story. Now, if you think I'm making this up, look at the legislation, contact your local politician, and you will see how broad this legislation is. This legislation could never have been brought in the United States or the United Kingdom. Never. Because of their constitutional protections. Although the United Kingdom doesn't have a constitution, it does have legal precedent. So it's an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in Australia in 2018 because of the current constitutional arrangements. Now, if you want to change the Constitution is structured in such a way as to make it almost impossible to change the Constitution. You need a majority in both houses of Parliament to put a question to the people. And that question has to be supported by a majority of people in a majority of states to be incorporated in the Australian Constitution. So at no stage do the people directly have an input into the process to change the Constitution. That is a parliamentary and a government prerogative and privilege. There is no citizens-initiated referendums. There is no role for them in the Australian Constitution. There is no role, as we see in Switzerland, for citizens to bring questions to the community for adjudication regarding incorporation into their constitution. None whatsoever. So we have a constitution which basically has nothing to offer the individual. It does not protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. It does not protect the individual from the corporate sector. It does not protect the individual, in a workplace. It's quite extraordinary how little power we really have, how few protections we really have in this country. About the only thing you have in terms of values is the ability to worship whatever religion you like to worship. That's one. And two, the ability to be fairly compensated if the federal government acquires your private property. Not the state government, but the federal government. So we see state governments around the country acquiring people's property and paying them minimal compensation. Now, the Australian Constitution is a relatively slim document. I think it's got about 154 sections to it. You should read it. And I think once you read it, you'll begin to realise how little protection you have from the arbitrary exercise of state power. Under the current constitutional arrangements, if the federal government had a majority in both houses of Parliament which found that blue-eyed 2-year-olds were the spawn of the devil and should be executed, they could be, constitutionally. Because there are no limits on how state power is exercised. No limits in the Australian Constitution. And those of you who think that democracy is incorporated in the Australian Constitution, maybe there are some vague references to parliamentary democracy. There are no references to any other type of, democracy. This is a representative, democratic, so-called system where those who have money and power are able to dominate the electoral process. For example, I'll give you a few examples. There's going to be a federal election in May, and I think this will be the first time in decades that I don't believe I will be standing in the federal election. And I'll tell you why. Because the current constitutional arrangements that are in place basically ensure that political parties dominate the parliamentary process. You can't even have the word independent next to your name as a Senate candidate because the government is and the opposition are concerned about people flocking to independence. So if you do have the capacity to sit in the Senate and stand for a Senate position, you can't even have the word independent next to your name. You don't even have a box, above the line in many cases if you stand as an individual. So think about it. Parliamentary democracy, representative democracy, giving a representative a signed blank cheque to make decisions for you for the next 3 to 4 years. That is representative democracy, and they expect you to sit on the sidelines and wait for the next federal election and the next election and the next election and the next election. Well, do they have something to answer for? Because we are the opposition. The current opposition isn't the opposition. We are the opposition. The people are the opposition. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people. It is not the rule of parliamentary representatives who owe their primary allegiance to a political party, not to the people they represent. And to make things even more difficult, I could promise to give you $5 billion each if I was standing at the election. And if I was elected and said, well, stuff you, there's nothing you could do until the next election. And we see individuals change political parties in mid-term. We see individuals become so-called independents in mid-term because their responsibility is not to the electorate. The electorate can't recall them, can't call a fresh election. Their responsibility is to the political party that has pre-selected them for a relatively safe seat. And that's why pre-selection battles are so bitter in many cases for that very reason. This is the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. Look, I think you know, I'm Secretary of the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. We are a small organisation with about 550 members, around 400 on the electoral roll, who's trying to be registered as a federal political party. Not for this election, but for the next election, the election in 2022. Now, we do need members. It's very simple. We do need more members on the electoral roll to apply for registration as a federal political party. So why do you want to be a federal political party, Joe? Why does public interest before corporate interest want to get involved in the parliamentary circus? Well, it's simple. We need to get ideas across. We need to get ideas across to people. And a good way is to be involved in the parliamentary electoral farce. It is a good way to give people alternatives or access to alternatives they would never see in 1,000,000 years. In 1,000 years, they would not see these changes. So, think about it. We can have the current political system, which is dominated not by parliamentarians, but which is dominated by unaccountable corporations who put major pressure on parliamentary political parties and individuals to pass legislation which continues to reinforce their power at the expense of the nation, at the expense of the community, at the expense of the state, at the expense of individuals. This is the current situation we find ourselves in. We live in a nominal democracy, not a real democracy, a nominal democracy. And historically, Australians have deserted this concept of nominal democracy. In the 1920s, I think it was 1922, legislation was passed to make voting compulsory because only about 25% of people actually voted at the previous election. And over a number of years, we've had more and more people being forced to participate in this parliamentary farce. And we'll see it again in May. We'll see again who pulls the parliamentary strings. And the parliamentary strings are pulled by that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And those of you who think that social media and the World Wide Web is the answer, think again. Think again. It's not the answer. You can like as many things as you like. You can stand on your head and masturbate in front of your computer. It's not going to make any difference. Unless we get feet on the street, as we've seen in Sudan recently, as we've seen in other parts of the world, you will not get change. Change comes from action. And that brings me to the current public interest before corporate interest campaign to put public housing on the political, social and cultural agenda in this country. Because it needs to be put on the agenda. And I'd like to thank those people who on a Wednesday in Melbourne join us at 6 a.m. on the steps of the Victorian Parliament to make public housing an issue. Because public housing is everybody's business. Secure accommodation is everybody's business. Leaving the housing market to the private sector is a total disaster. And we have seen the escalation of prices over the last 2 decades, almost 450% escalation in prices for the same property. And all it's done is enrich the speculators and the investors who use this country's investment-friendly laws to maximise their profits at the expense of each and every one of us. So, it's up to you. And I'm pretty confident that after the next election, 95% of parliamentary seats will be held by major political parties. Because these major political parties are really no threat to the status quo. As we've seen with the Banking Royal Commission, the number of heads that are going to roll are going to be minimal. There'll be a few sacrificial heads that will roll, but because of the appeals process, it may take decades for those heads to roll. Decades. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, you may think you live in the lucky country. And I'm sure when you come back overseas, you fall on your hands and knees and kiss the earth and say, thank the deities that I'm back in the land of milk and honey. And maybe in comparison to some countries, we do live a reasonably good life, politically and economically. But there are an increasing number of people in this country who are falling between the cracks. What we've seen in the last 2 decades is a war being declared on those who are least able to defend themselves. We've seen a war, not just a war of words, but a war, literally a war, declared against people who receive social security benefits. And over a third of Australians, over 33.3%, receive social security benefits because they're old, they're disabled, they belong to single-parent families. And in order to receive this minuscule support from a government, they have to jump through so many hoops that many people don't even bother to apply and suffer in silence. Because we see how language has been debased in order to humiliate and degrade people because they are not part of the wage system, because they're retired, because they're on a single parent's benefit, because they're on a disabled support pension. And we're talking about 1 in 3 Australians. And let's not forget that under current research, we know that 4 million Australians, that's about 8% of people, 8 in 100, go hungry to bed at night. And many of these are children. And we know there are increasing rates of homelessness. And we know there's increasing rates of anxiety because of the speed up of the productive process, increasing rates of mental illness, increasing rates of people not being able to cope because of the changes that we've seen in society. And most of these changes are driven by people and corporations who want to maximise profits, whether it's for shareholders or themselves, but maximise profits irrespective of the human, social, environmental costs. Maximise those profits. And those royal commissions we've seen into these corporatised entities has highlighted time and time and time again that it's that race to maximise profits which causes the problems which we are faced with today in 2019. It's quite an extraordinary situation when you think about it. 4 million Australians go to bed hungry. Over 20% live below the poverty line. About 70% of Australians are debt up to their necks, and if they lose their jobs, they'll lose their homes and be declared bankrupt. And all the while, we have political representatives who deny that there is an issue, who talk about, the fact that we need to protect taxpayers' money. It's all very well talking about protecting taxpayers' money when you're talking about social security benefits, but how about protecting taxpayers' money when we talk about corporate welfare? We talk about the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, which are given to the corporate sector in terms of tax breaks and in terms of sustenance. Think about it. Just think about it. It is a difficult situation because things aren't getting better. And if things were getting better, you would think there'd be a decrease in the number of children that have a chance to develop themselves to their fullest potential. Because years ago, decades ago, the social elevator, which was such an integral part of life in Australia, was turned off. And then it was dismantled, and then the pieces were sold for scrap metal. So we get to a situation today where we don't actually have the social and community infrastructure to provide services to people. No wonder people become anxious and depressed and angry and drop out and don't participate. It seems to be the reason that we find ourselves in this situation. Now look at this public housing everybody's business campaign. It's a very simple campaign. It doesn't need blood in the streets. It doesn't need revolutionary change. All it needs is a majority of members in the Victorian Legislative Assembly. There's 88 members, so you need 45. And a majority of members in the Legislative Council, there's 40 members, you need 21, to pass legislation to quarantine stamp duty receipts. Now, stamp duty stands at about 6% of the sale of a house. Now, you may find this extraordinary, but somebody, if you can find a unit somewhere for $225,000, you'll be paying $8,500 stamp duty to the state government for the privilege of buying some real estate. So why shouldn't stamp duty revenue, which stands at around $6 billion per year in Victoria, be used for public housing, to spot purchase houses around the community, to house people who are having difficulty in finding safe, secure housing? Because at the end of the day, everybody's a winner. It's one of those Tats Lotto games where everybody wins. Everybody wins first or second division. It's very simple. You have a strong public housing sector. Fewer people need to rent. If fewer people need to rent, rents drop. If rents drop, investors sell property at the lower end of the market. Property price at the lower end of the market decrease. Young people, first-home buyers, can get involved in the market. If you provide safe, secure accommodation to people for 25% of their income, well, then crime will decrease. You won't see people living rough on the streets on a daily basis, not just in the CBDs of our cities, but in the suburbs of our cities, people living in cars, children and women living in cars, people living on the streets trying to eke out an existence, finding they can't get social security assistance because they don't have the necessary identification. And the list goes on and on. And doesn't seem to be incapable of change. And that's the problem. Everything seems to be just too hard. Just too hard. Because Parliament can't come together to look at the situation we find ourselves in and make some fundamental changes to ensure that everybody shares in the Commonwealth. So what can you do? Well, you can jump up and down and throw a rock at your television set. You can rip out your mouse out of your computer and stomp on it. You can stop paying your, monthly internet fees and, boot social media out of your life. Or you can become involved in activity. You can become involved in campaigns which make a difference. Campaigns which devolve power, which, share power, and campaigns which share wealth. Because these are the campaigns that ultimately change lives. Not only your life, but the lives of the people around you. These are the campaigns which devolve power and share wealth. Because we do live in the Commonwealth of Australia. It's hard to believe, isn't it? The Commonwealth of Australia, where 1 in 3 Australians relies on social security benefits to survive, where 1 in 6 Australians goes to bed hungry, where over 1 million children live in poverty and will never get out of the situation because the public education system is so poorly funded that they will never be in a situation to be able to compete with their brothers and sisters in the private sector. And that's the key to Australian life. If you got money, you're going to do extremely well. And the more money you have, the more better your life will be because you pay less taxes. I know it's incredible, isn't it? You pay less taxes if you have more money because you can avail yourself of all those legislative attempts to increase investment in this country. All those legislative attempts which give a gold star to all those people who exploit us. You can get a tax deduction for owning more than one home in this country, but you can't get a tax deduction, for a deposit on a home. You can get a tax deduction if you're a large corporation because you're just a large corporation. But you can't get a decent New Start allowance for the 1 million people who rely on a New Start allowance to survive. You can't get on disability support pension in 2019 because the criteria to get a disability support pension has become so onerous that fewer and fewer people are actually able to access that. So what we are seeing is a government running around with a large pair of scissors cutting holes in the social security net, and more people in this country falling through those holes and causing damage to themselves and the communities they live in. You've been listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I've been hosting this program. If you want to learn more, you can go to our website, anarchistmedia.org. If you want to join public interest before corporate interests, you can download the application form from PIBCI, PIBCI.net. You can write to me. Yes, I do answer letters to Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. You can leave lovely messages at 0439 395 489. Send me a nasty message and I'll delete it, so don't waste your time. You can go to our YouTube channel. Yes, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest has a YouTube channel and find out what's going on. And if you're into Twitter, well, I'm even twittering again. Watch out, Donald. I'm twittering. After 2 years of being in the wilderness, I'm retwittering. You go to PIBCI, PIBCI_AU, PIBCI, PIBCI_AU. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World This Week, courtesy of the Community Radio Broadcasting Network across this country, north to south, east to west, in every state and every territory. The Anarchist World This Week. This program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. And if you're really keen, you can go to my personal Facebook page, Toscano for the Public. Toscano for the Public. And if you want to know what I look like, which could be a bit of a shock for you, go to the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest YouTube channel. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World This Week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is podcast. Don't despair if nature called, the bikie next door needed some sugar for his meth lab, or you fell over and fell asleep because, you were tired. Well, don't despair. You can access this program via podcast. Go to 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World This Week on your local community radio station. And if your local community radio station does not broadcast The Anarchist World This Week, and I've got no idea why they wouldn't, go to the Community Radio Network. Go to your station manager. Ask them, are you a member of the Community Radio Network? And if they are, they should be able to broadcast the Anarchist World This Week. You can broadcast all of it, some of it, now or later. It can be broadcast as long as you put a bit of pressure on your local community radio station to broadcast the Anarchist World This Week. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World This Week on your local community radio station. That Facebook page, Toscano for the Public. The phone number 0439 395 489. Download the application form, PIBCI, PIBCI.net, to join public interest before corporate interest. Go to their webpage. It's been updated. They tell me it's wonderful. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.